The air in Atlanta was thick with the weight of summer, and in a modest house on Auburn Avenue, a child was born into a world that did not yet know what to do with him. The year was 1929, and the nation was beginning to feel the tremors of economic collapse, though in this neighborhood the struggle was older, deeper, woven into the fabric of every day. The boy was named Michael, after his father, though later both would take the name Martin Luther, after the great reformer who had challenged an empire with nothing but conviction and a few written words. His grandfather had been a preacher, and his father was a preacher, and the church was not merely a building, but a kind of sanctuary where the spirit could breathe even when the world outside pressed down with all its weight. The boy grew up surrounded by voices raised in song, by the cadence of scripture, by the particular rhythm of a tradition that had survived the unspeakable and transformed suffering into something that could be sung. He did not choose this inheritance, but it chose him, quietly, the way a river chooses its course. Auburn Avenue was a world unto itself, a place where black life flourished despite the walls that surrounded it. There were businesses owned by black families, doctors and lawyers and teachers who had carved out space for dignity in a nation that legislated their inferiority. The boy walked these streets and saw what was possible, even as he began to understand what was forbidden. There were places he could not go, water fountains he could not drink from, doors that would not open no matter how politely he knocked. The architecture of segregation was everywhere, invisible to those who benefited from it, unmistakable to those who did not. He was a bright child, quick with words, curious about the world in that particular way that troubles adults who prefer questions to remain unasked. He read voraciously, and his mind moved faster than his years. At school, he absorbed everything offered and reached for more, though even there, the curriculum was constrained, the resources meager, the message clear that this education was meant to prepare him for a limited life. But his parents, especially his mother, nurtured something else in him, a sense that he was meant for more than what the world had decided to allow. His father was a man of fierce dignity, the kind that does not bend easily. Reverend King S.R. had built Ebenezer Baptist Church into a pillar of the community, and he carried himself with an authority that demanded respect even from those who would deny it. The boy watched his father refuse to be diminished, saw him stand tall in rooms where others cowered, heard him preach with a power that seemed to come from some deeper well. It was a kind of strength, but it was also a kind of burden, and the boy felt both the pride and the weight of it. There was an incident, small in itself but large in meaning, that the boy would carry with him. He had a friend, a white child from across the invisible line that divided the neighborhood, and they played together with the easy innocence of children who do not yet understand the rules. But one day the friend's father forbade them to play together anymore, and the boy came home confused, hurt in a way he could not quite name. His mother held him and explained, as gently as she could, the nature of the world they lived in. She told him that he was as good as anyone, that the laws were wrong, that he must never accept the lie of his own inferiority. But she could not explain why the world was this way, not in a way that satisfied a child's sense of fairness, and so the question remained, unresolved, a wound that would not quite heal. He grew older, and the questions grew with him. He was admitted to Morehouse College at 15, too young in years, but already restless with the need to understand. Morehouse was a place where black excellence was not an exception, but an expectation, where the faculty believed in the capacity of their students to shape the future. It was here that he began to discover language for what he had always felt, that the suffering of his people was not natural or inevitable, but the result of choices, systems, structures that could be challenged and changed. There was a professor, Benjamin Mays, who became a kind of spiritual father to him. Mays spoke of religion not as an escape from the world, but as a force that must engage the world, transform it, make it more just. He spoke of Jesus not as a figure of meekness, but as a revolutionary who had challenged the powers of his time and paid the ultimate price. This was a Christianity the boy had not quite encountered before, though perhaps it had always been there, waiting in the songs his people sang, in the prayers they whispered in the dark. It gave him a framework, a way to understand that faith and justice were not separate things, but two streams flowing from the same source. He was still uncertain about his path, though everyone assumed he would follow his father into the pulpit. There was a part of him that resisted, that wanted something else, though he could not say what. He thought perhaps he would study medicine or law, something that felt more concrete, more modern. But there was another pull, deeper and harder to deny, the sense that he had been given a gift for words, and that this gift had a purpose beyond his own ambition. In the summer, he worked jobs that brought him face to face with the machinery of injustice. He traveled north and saw that segregation was not merely a southern affliction, but a national disease, manifesting differently but no less real. He worked alongside men who labored without dignity, who were paid wages that mocked the value of their work, and he felt a rage that he did not yet know how to channel. But he also felt something else, a conviction that this could not stand, that history was not finished, that change was not only necessary but possible. He graduated from Morehouse and decided, finally, to enter the ministry, though not in the way his father had. He would go to seminary, to Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he would be one of only a handful of black students. It was a risk, stepping into that world, but he went with a hunger to learn, to test his ideas against the best minds he could find. At Crozer, he read widely, voraciously, everything from Plato to Hegel, from Rauschenbusch to Reinhold Niebuhr. He wrestled with Marx and found truth in the critique of economic exploitation, though he could not accept the materialist worldview that denied the spiritual dimension of existence. It was during these years that he encountered the writings and example of Mahatma Gandhi, and something shifted in him, clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. Here was a man who had faced an empire with nothing but moral force, who had insisted that the means must be consistent with the ends, that violence could never truly liberate, because it carried within itself the seeds of new oppression. Gandhi had called it satyagraha, truth force, soul force, and it resonated with something the boy had always believed but could not name. Love was not weakness. It was the most powerful force in the universe, and it could be wielded with precision and courage against even the most entrenched injustice. He graduated from Crozer at the top of his class, and went on to Boston University to pursue a doctorate in systematic theology. Boston was another world, colder in climate and culture, but intellectually vibrant, and he threw himself into the work. It was here that he met a young woman named Coretta Scott, who was studying voice at the New England Conservatory. She was from Alabama, and she understood the world he came from, but she also had her own dreams, her own ambitions. Their courtship was brief but intense, and he knew, or believed he knew, that she was meant to walk this path with him. They married, and the question became where to go, what to do with all this preparation, all this learning. There were offers from universities, comfortable positions that would allow him to think and write and teach. But there was also a call from a church in Montgomery, Alabama, a city deep in the heart of the segregated South, and despite every rational reason to choose otherwise, he felt drawn to it. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was small but dignified, and its congregation was educated, politically aware, ready perhaps for a pastor who would not shy away from the difficult questions. So they went south, the young couple, and settled into the life of a pastor and his wife in a city that seemed on the surface to be at peace with its inequalities. He preached on Sundays, visited the sick, attended to the rhythms of parish life. Coretta sang and taught music and tried to make a home in a place that felt both familiar and foreign. And for a time, it seemed as though this might be enough, a good life, a meaningful life, but not the life that would be remembered. But history was already in motion, and it would soon come knocking at his door in the form of a seamstress named Rosa Parks, who, on a December evening in 1955, refused to give up her seat on a city bus. Her arrest was not the first such incident, but it was the one that sparked something, that lit a fuse that had been laid over decades, over centuries. The black community of Montgomery was ready, had been organizing, had been waiting for the right moment, and now the moment had arrived. The young pastor was 26 years old, new to the city, not yet tested in the kind of struggle that was about to unfold. But he had a gift for words, and he had a vision of how the struggle must be waged. And when the community gathered to decide on a course of action, they looked to him to articulate what they all felt. A boycott, they decided, a refusal to ride the buses until the system of segregation was dismantled. It seemed impossible, audacious, a challenge to the entire structure of power in the city. But he stood before them and spoke of dignity, of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, and they believed, or wanted to believe, that it could be done. The boycott began, and it did not end in days or weeks, but stretched on for more than a year. The people of Montgomery walked to work, organized carpools, wore out their shoes rather than submit to a system that diminished their humanity. The city fought back with arrests, with intimidation, with violence. The young pastor's home was bombed, and he stood on his porch and urged the crowd that gathered not to respond with violence, to hold fast to the principle of love even in the face of hatred. It was tested then, this philosophy of nonviolence, tested in fire and found, somehow, to hold. He discovered in those months what it meant to lead, to carry the hopes and fears of thousands, to make decisions that could cost lives, including his own. There were nights when he could not sleep, when the weight of it pressed down until he thought he might break. There was a night alone in his kitchen in the early hours when he prayed with a desperation he had never known, admitted his fear, his inadequacy, and felt, or believed, he felt a presence, a voice, that told him to stand up for righteousness, to stand up for truth, and God would be with him. It was a moment of conversion, not to faith, which he had always had, but to a kind of faith that could sustain action even in the presence of terror. The boycott ended in victory, though the word seemed insufficient for what had actually occurred. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, and the people of Montgomery boarded the buses again, this time sitting where they chose. But something larger had happened, something that could not be measured in court decisions or policy changes. A community had discovered its own power, had learned that dignity was not something that could be granted or withheld by others, but something that resided within, waiting to be claimed. And the young pastor had become something more than a pastor, though he did not yet fully understand what that meant. The victory in Montgomery rippled outward, and suddenly he was in demand, asked to speak, to lead, to lend his voice and presence to struggles across the South. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed, an organization that would coordinate the efforts of churches and communities working for civil rights, and he was elected its president. It was a role he had not sought but could not refuse, and it would consume the rest of his life, leaving little room for the quiet study and reflection he had once imagined for himself. He traveled constantly, preaching, organizing, meeting with leaders and ordinary people who were beginning to believe that change was possible. His speeches had a particular quality, a rhythm and music that drew from the black church tradition, but also from something deeper, older, a prophetic voice that spoke of judgment and redemption. He quoted the Bible and the Constitution with equal reverence, insisting that America had made promises it had not kept, that there were checks written to black citizens that had come back, marked insufficient funds. But he believed, or chose to believe, that the promise was real, that the nation could be called to live up to its ideals. The work was dangerous in ways large and small. There were constant threats, letters promising death, phone calls in the middle of the night filled with obscenities and hatred. He was arrested repeatedly, charged with minor infractions that were pretexts for intimidation. He was stabbed once in Harlem by a deranged woman, the blade coming so close to his aorta that the doctor told him a single sneeze could have killed him. He recovered, but the incident left him with a sharpened awareness of his own mortality, a sense that his time might be limited and must be used well. Coretta bore the weight of this life alongside him, raising their children in the midst of chaos, never knowing if he would return from a trip, if the next phone call would bring news of his arrest or worse. She had given up her own dreams of a singing career, though she incorporated music into the movement, performing at benefits and rallies. There was a tension in their marriage, never quite resolved, between his calling and her sacrifice, between the public mission and the private cost. He loved her, but the movement demanded everything, and there was little left over for the quiet domesticity he sometimes longed for, but could not quite inhabit. The movement itself was not monolithic, not a single unified force, but a collection of organizations and individuals with different strategies, different philosophies, different ideas about how freedom should be won. There were those who believed nonviolence was too slow, too accommodating, who wanted to meet violence with violence. There were those who questioned whether integration was even the goal, whether black people should seek acceptance into a society that had never wanted them or build their own separate institutions. He listened to these arguments, wrestled with them, but held to his conviction that non-violence was not merely a tactic, but a way of life, a recognition of the fundamental unity of all people. The sit-ins began. College students in Greensboro and Nashville and Atlanta refusing to leave lunch counters that would not serve them, willing to be beaten and arrested rather than accept humiliation. He admired their courage, felt both pride and a kind of envy that they could act so decisively. When students in Atlanta were arrested, he joined them in jail, a symbolic act of solidarity that became something more when the judge refused to release him, when he was sentenced to hard labor for a minor traffic violation. It was a terrifying moment, the realization that he could simply disappear into the prison system, that the law offered no protection against those determined to destroy him. But the incident also revealed the growing power of the movement. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy made a phone call to Coretta expressing concern, and his brother Robert made calls to secure his release. It was a political calculation, an attempt to win black votes, but it worked, and when he walked out of prison, he knew that the movement had become too large to ignore, that even those who wielded national power had to reckon with it. The Freedom Rides came next, integrated groups of activists riding buses through the South to test whether the Supreme Court's rulings against segregated interstate travel would be enforced. The riders were met with savage violence, buses burned, riders beaten by mobs while police stood by and watched. He supported the rides, but did not join them, a decision that drew criticism from some who felt he was too cautious, too concerned with his own safety. The criticism strung because there was truth in it, because he did feel fear, did have a family, did make calculations about where his leadership would be most effective. But he also knew that leadership required strategic thinking, not just courage, and that getting himself killed in Alabama would not advance the cause. Birmingham became the testing ground for a new phase of the movement. It was the most segregated city in America, a place where violence against black citizens was routine and unpunished. The police commissioner, Bull Connor, was a brutal enforcer of white supremacy, and the city's power structure was unyielding. But precisely because it was so resistant, Birmingham offered an opportunity to dramatize the struggle, to show the nation and the world what segregation actually meant. The campaign was carefully planned. Waves of protesters filling the jails, economic pressure through boycotts of downtown businesses, and always the discipline of non-violence, even in the face of provocation. He knew it would be ugly, knew that Connor would respond with force, and there was a moral complexity to this that troubled him. Was it right to place people, especially young people, in harm's way to make a political point? Was it manipulation to use suffering as a tool of persuasion? These questions had no easy answers, but he believed, had to believe, that the suffering was redemptive, that there was a spiritual dimension to the struggle that transcended tactics and strategy. The images that came out of Birmingham shocked the nation. Fire hoses turned on children with enough force to strip bark from trees, police dogs attacking peaceful protesters, young people filling the jails with such numbers that the system could barely function. The photographs went around the world, and suddenly Birmingham was not just a local conflict, but an international embarrassment, a refutation of America's claims to be the leader of the free world. President Kennedy, who had been cautious about civil rights, was forced to act, to propose legislation that would dismantle legal segregation. But in the midst of this, he found himself arrested again, placed in solitary confinement in Birmingham jail. It was there, in that cell, that he wrote a letter that would become one of his most enduring statements. It was written in response to white clergymen who had criticized the demonstrations as untimely and extreme, who had counseled patience and gradualism. He wrote in the margins of a newspaper, on scraps of paper, pouring out his frustration with the white moderate who preferred order to justice, his disappointment with the church that had remained silent in the face of evil. He wrote of the fierce urgency of now, of the fact that justice delayed is justice denied, of the moral responsibility to break unjust laws. The letter was eloquent and angry and deeply theological, a defense of civil disobedience rooted in the highest moral traditions of both Christianity and democracy. The March on Washington followed, a gathering of hundreds of thousands at the Lincoln Memorial to demand jobs and freedom. He was not the only speaker, but he was the one people had come to hear, and he stood before that vast crowd and delivered a speech that became the defining statement of the movement. He spoke of a dream, a vision of a nation where his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was hopeful and patriotic and deeply American, calling the nation to live up to its own professed values. The crowd responded with a kind of ecstatic affirmation, and for a moment it seemed as though the impossible might actually happen, that the long arc of history might bend more quickly than anyone had dared to imagine. But the euphoria was short-lived. Less than 3 weeks later, a bomb exploded in a Birmingham church, killing 4 young girls attending Sunday school. The news came like a blow, a reminder that the forces of hatred were not defeated, that every step forward was met with violent resistance. He preached at the funeral, and his words were full of grief and rage, though he tried to channel both into a renewed commitment to the struggle. The girls had not died in vain, he insisted. Their deaths would galvanize the nation, would make clear the moral bankruptcy of segregation. But in private, he wept and wondered whether the cost was too high, whether anything could justify this suffering. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, a legislative victory that outlawed discrimination in public accommodations and employment. It was a triumph, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. He was invited to the White House to witness President Johnson signing the bill, and he stood there surrounded by other leaders of the movement, knowing that they had achieved something remarkable. But he also knew that laws alone would not transform hearts, that the deeper work of changing consciousness and culture was only beginning. The Nobel Peace Prize came as a surprise, an honor he felt was not his alone, but belonged to the movement, to all those who had marched and sat in and gone to jail and risked everything for a vision of justice. He traveled to Oslo to receive it, and at 35, he was the youngest person ever to win the award. In his acceptance speech, he spoke of nonviolence as the answer to the crucial moral question of the age, the way humanity might move beyond the cycle of violence and revenge that had characterized so much of history. He donated the prize money to the movement, keeping nothing for himself. But even as he was being celebrated internationally, the movement was fracturing domestically. Younger activists were losing patience with non-violence, questioning whether it could achieve more than symbolic victories. The slogan, Black Power, was gaining currency, with its implications of self-defense and separatism. Malcolm X, who had long criticized his approach as too accommodating, was assassinated in 1965, and the loss was profound despite their disagreements. Malcolm had represented a different strand of black thought, one that refused to appeal to white conscience, that insisted on dignity and power on black terms. His death left a vacuum and raised questions about whether the non-violent path could survive in a climate of escalating rage. The focus shifted to voting rights, to the fundamental question of political power. Selma, Alabama became the battleground, a city where black citizens constituted a majority of the population, but only a tiny fraction of registered voters, kept from the polls by literacy tests and intimidation. The strategy was similar to Birmingham: fill the jails, create a crisis, force federal intervention. He led a march from Selma to the state capital in Montgomery, but on the first attempt, marchers were met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by state troopers who attacked with clubs and tear gas in full view of television cameras. The images of Bloody Sunday horrified the nation and galvanized support for federal voting rights legislation. He returned to Selma and led the march again, this time with federal protection, and thousands joined, walking for days until they reached Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act was passed, another legislative victory, another step toward the goal. But he was beginning to understand that the struggle was larger than voting rights or desegregation, that the problems facing Black America were deeply entangled with issues of poverty and economic exploitation. That racism was not just a matter of individual prejudice, but of systemic structures that had to be dismantled. He began to speak more openly about economic justice, about the ways that capitalism had failed not just Black Americans, but poor people of all races. This was dangerous territory, more threatening to the established order than demands for integration. When he talked about redistributing wealth, about guaranteed incomes, about the right to a job or an income as a basic human right, he was challenging the fundamental assumptions of American society. The coalition that had supported civil rights began to fracture, and he found himself increasingly isolated, criticized from the left as too moderate and from the right as too radical. The movement went north to Chicago, where segregation was not written into law but was no less real, enforced through housing discrimination and economic inequality. He moved his family into a tenement in one of the city's worst slums, wanting to experience firsthand the conditions people lived in, wanting to understand the texture of northern racism. The campaign focused on open housing, on the right of black families to live wherever they could afford. But the marches through white neighborhoods were met with a hatred more virulent than anything he had experienced in the South. Rocks and bottles were thrown, Nazi symbols were displayed, and he realized that racial hatred was not a regional problem, but a national disease. The Chicago campaign did not achieve its goals, not in any clear way, and the sense of momentum that had carried the movement forward began to dissipate. The riots that broke out in Watts and Newark and Detroit suggested that many black Americans had lost faith in nonviolence, that anger was boiling over into destruction. He condemned the riots, but also tried to explain them, to make clear that they were the language of the unheard, the inevitable result of decades of neglect and oppression. But his words satisfied no one, seemed to place him in a middle ground that was rapidly disappearing. The war in Vietnam was escalating, consuming resources and lives, and he could no longer remain silent about it. His advisors urged caution, warned that speaking against the war would alienate President Johnson and jeopardize support for civil rights. But he felt a moral obligation to speak, believed that the same principles that guided his work for justice at home demanded opposition to an unjust war abroad. At Riverside Church in New York, he delivered a speech calling the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Linking the war to poverty and racism, arguing that a nation that spent billions on military destruction, while its own poor lacked basic necessities, had lost its moral compass. The reaction was swift and severe. Newspapers that had praised him now condemned him, civil rights leaders distanced themselves, and the FBI, which had been monitoring him for years, intensified its campaign of harassment. He was called a traitor, accused of being influenced by communists, attacked from all sides. The isolation was profound, and there were times when he wondered whether he had made a mistake, whether he should have stayed in his lane and focused only on civil rights. But he could not compartmentalize his conscience, could not champion justice in one area while ignoring injustice in another. His reading had deepened during these years, and he spent what little free time he had immersed in theology and philosophy, searching for frameworks that could make sense of the struggle. He read Paul Tillich and Martin Buber, revisited Gandhi and the theologians of liberation emerging from Latin America. He was drawn to thinkers who understood that faith was not a retreat from the world, but an engagement with it, that God was present in the struggle for justice, that the kingdom of heaven was not some distant reward, but something to be built here and now. He began to talk about the beloved community, a vision of society transformed not just legally, but spiritually, where people of all races and backgrounds lived together in mutual respect and care. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps impossibly so, but he believed that without such a vision, the struggle became only about power and self-interest, lost its moral center. The beloved community was not integration for its own sake, but a recognition of the fundamental interconnectedness of all people, the understanding that no one could be fully free until everyone was free. But the vision seemed to be receding even as he articulated it more clearly. The country was tearing itself apart over Vietnam, over race, over fundamental questions about what kind of nation it wanted to be. The assassinations continued, not just of movement leaders, but of anyone who seemed to threaten the status quo. He knew he was a target, had been told many times that there were plots against his life. He accepted this as the price of leadership, tried not to dwell on it, though it cast a shadow over everything. He began planning what would be called the Poor People's Campaign, an effort to bring together poor people of all races to demand economic justice. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, requiring a level of coalition building across racial lines that had rarely been achieved. The idea was to bring thousands of poor people to Washington, to camp out on the National Mall until the government addressed their demands for jobs, housing, education. It was a return to the tactics of direct action, but now focused on economic rather than purely racial justice. The planning was difficult, the logistics overwhelming, and there were deep divisions within the movement about strategy and goals. Some thought it was too broad, diluting the focus on black empowerment. Others thought it was not radical enough, that the system could not be reformed but had to be overthrown. He listened to all the arguments, tried to hold together a coalition that was fraying at every edge, knowing that failure would discredit not just the campaign, but the entire philosophy of nonviolent, direct action. In the midst of this planning, he received a call from Memphis, where sanitation workers were on strike for better wages and working conditions. The workers were almost all black, and the city's response had been to ignore their demands and suppress their protests. It seemed like a small local issue, but he saw in it all the themes he had been grappling with: the intersection of race and class, the dignity of labor, the right of working people to organize and demand justice. He decided to go to Memphis, to lend his support to the strike, even though it meant delaying work on the Poor People's Campaign. The first march in Memphis ended in chaos and violence, with some young people breaking windows and looting, giving the police an excuse to crack down. He was devastated, felt that his presence had somehow contributed to the violence rather than preventing it. Critics pounced, saying it proved that non-violence was dead, that he had lost control of the movement. He knew he had to return to Memphis, had to lead another march that would demonstrate the power of disciplined non-violence, had to prove that the philosophy could still work. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, worn down by years of struggle and sacrifice and disappointment. His health was deteriorating. He was not yet 40, but looked much older, the stress etched into his face. He suffered from insomnia and depression, and there were times when the weight of everything seemed unbearable. But he kept going, driven by something deeper than will, by a sense that he had been called to this work and could not turn away no matter how difficult it became. He returned to Memphis in early April of 1968, determined to organize a successful march that would vindicate both the sanitation workers and the principle of non-violence. The night before the planned march, he spoke at Mason Temple to a crowd of supporters. It was a stormy night, and he almost did not go, was tired and dispirited, and felt he had nothing new to say. But Ralph Abernathy, his closest friend and lieutenant, urged him to come, and so he went. The speech he delivered that night was unlike anything he had given before, more personal, more prophetic, shot through with a premonition of his own death. He talked about the bomb threats that had delayed his flight, about the danger that surrounded the movement. And then he said something that seemed to come from beyond himself, that he had been to the mountaintop, that he had seen the promised land, that he might not get there with them, but that they as a people would reach it. The crowd erupted, sensing that they were witnessing something profound, though no one could have known how prophetic the words would prove to be. The next day he was in good spirits, laughing and joking with his staff, planning the march, talking about dinner. He stepped out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel to get some air before heading to a local minister's house for a meal. A shot rang out, a single bullet fired from a rooming house across the street, and he fell, mortally wounded. His friends rushed to him, cradled his head, but there was nothing to be done. He was taken to the hospital but died within the hour, and the news spread across the nation and the world like wildfire. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cities erupted in riots, flames consuming whole neighborhoods as people gave vent to rage and grief. President Johnson declared a day of mourning and urged calm, but his words seemed hollow to those who had watched the slow pace of progress, who felt that nonviolence had been met only with violence, that the one man who had counseled patience and love had been struck down. The assassination seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions that America would not change peacefully, that power would use any means necessary to preserve itself. The funeral was held in Atlanta, and tens of thousands lined the streets as a simple mule-drawn wagon carried his casket through the city. It was a deliberate choice, the mule cart, a symbol of the poor people he had championed, a rejection of the pomp that often surrounds the death of famous men. The eulogies spoke of his greatness, his courage, his vision, but they could not quite capture what had been lost, the particular combination of moral clarity and strategic brilliance and personal charisma that had made him irreplaceable. Coretta became the keeper of his legacy, establishing the King Center and working to ensure that his teachings were not forgotten or diluted. She knew that there would be attempts to domesticate his message, to turn him into a safe symbol of reconciliation who had never challenged anyone or anything. She fought against this revisionism, insisted that he had been radical, that he had spoken truth to power, that his dream of the beloved community was not a passive hope, but an active demand for transformation. The Poor People's Campaign went forward without him, thousands camping on the National Mall in a settlement called Resurrection City, but it lacked his leadership and ultimately failed to achieve its goals. The movement itself began to fragment further, with some embracing more militant approaches and others turning to electoral politics and institution building. The moment of moral clarity that he had represented seemed to pass, replaced by a more complex and contested landscape, where there were many voices and no single unifying vision. The question of who killed him remained contested, with many refusing to believe the official story that a lone racist gunman was solely responsible. Theories of conspiracy abounded, implicating various government agencies and powerful interests that had reason to want him silenced. His family eventually came to believe that there had been a broader plot, though the full truth remained elusive, obscured by destroyed evidence and official stonewalling. What was clear was that he had been perceived as a threat, not just to Southern segregationists, but to a national order built on inequality and violence. In the years after his death, his reputation underwent a transformation. The man who had been reviled by many, surveilled by the FBI, criticized as too radical or not radical enough, was gradually canonized as an American saint. A national holiday was established in his honor, and schoolchildren memorized the "I have a dream" speech without necessarily grappling with his more challenging teachings about economic justice and militarism. Streets and schools and monuments were named after him, and his image was used to sell everything from cars to phone service. This domestication of his legacy was both inevitable and tragic, a pattern that repeats with revolutionary figures who become absorbed into the very systems they challenged. The radical edge of his message, the parts that made people uncomfortable, were often softened or ignored. Few wanted to remember that he had called for massive redistribution of wealth, that he had compared American foreign policy to the violence of totalitarian regimes, that he had been willing to break laws he considered unjust and urged others to do the same. But his actual words and deeds remained, available to anyone willing to look beyond the sanitized version. His speeches and sermons and writings were published and studied, and new generations discovered the fullness of his thought, the ways he had connected struggles that many preferred to keep separate. Scholars and activists returned to his work, looking for insights into their own times, finding in his analysis of racism and poverty and militarism a framework that remained disturbingly relevant. The beloved community he envisioned had not been realized, and in many ways the nation seemed to be moving away from it rather than toward it. Segregation in housing and schools persisted in different forms. Wealth inequality grew more extreme, and the prison system became a new mechanism of racial control. The hope that had animated the movement gave way to a more cynical understanding that change would be slower and harder than anyone had imagined, that each victory would be contested and incomplete. Yet there was also continuity, movements that took inspiration from his example even as they adapted his methods to new circumstances. The fight for workers' rights continued, often led by the same communities he had championed. Struggles against police violence and mass incarceration drew on the tradition of nonviolent resistance he had embodied. International movements for human rights and democracy looked to his life as proof that moral courage could challenge entrenched power. His children grew up without him, carrying both the pride of his legacy and the burden of living in his shadow. They became activists and speakers in their own right, though none could quite fill the space he had occupied. Coretta lived for nearly 40 years after his death, and she spent those years protecting his memory, expanding the institutions dedicated to his work, speaking out on the issues he had cared about. When she finally died, she was buried next to him at the King Center, and their joint tomb became a place of pilgrimage. The memorials and monuments multiplied over the decades. In Washington, not far from where he had delivered his most famous speech, a massive stone sculpture of him was erected, depicting him emerging from the mountain of despair, arms crossed, gaze steady, looking toward the horizon. Visitors came from around the world to stand before it, to take photographs, to read the quotes carved into the surrounding walls. Some came with genuine reverence, moved by the story of his life and the nobility of his cause. Others came because it was a tourist destination, one more stop on the circuit of American historical sites. The question of what he would think of the contemporary world, were he alive to see it, became a kind of parlor game, endlessly debated. Would he be heartened by the progress that had been made, by the election of a black president, by the increased representation of people of color in positions of power? Or would he be dismayed by the persistence of poverty and inequality, by the continuation of military interventions abroad, by the ways that racism had adapted and evolved rather than disappeared? The truth was unknowable, but people projected onto his memory their own hopes and fears, their own sense of where the struggle stood. What seemed clear was that the moral framework he had articulated remained relevant, perhaps even more so in a world that often seemed to have lost its moral bearings. His insistence that the means must be consistent with the ends, that violence could never bring lasting peace, that love was stronger than hate, these were not outdated platitudes, but challenging propositions that each generation had to grapple with anew. His life demonstrated that it was possible to stand for something, to risk everything for a principle, to believe that the world could be different, and to work toward that difference with everything you had. The theological dimensions of his thought often got lost in the secular retellings of his story, but they were central to who he was. He understood himself as responding to a divine calling, as participating in a cosmic drama of redemption. His faith was not a private comfort, but a public commitment, a source of both strength and obligation. He prayed constantly, drew sustenance from Scripture, believed that God was actively at work in history, bending it toward justice. This was not naive optimism, but a hard-won conviction maintained in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The discipline of nonviolence that he championed was rooted in this theology, in the belief that every person carried within them the image of God and therefore possessed infinite worth. To do violence to another person, even an enemy, was to do violence to that divine image. This was why he could say that the non-violent resistor seeks to defeat injustice rather than people, seeks to awaken a sense of moral shame in the opponent rather than to humiliate them. It required a kind of spiritual strength that few possessed, the ability to absorb violence without returning it, to love those who hated you. He knew this was asking a lot, perhaps too much, of ordinary people caught up in the struggle. There were times when he wondered whether he was being unrealistic, whether the philosophy of non-violence was suited only for saints and not for the messy reality of political struggle. But he held to it, because the alternative seemed to lead only to endless cycles of revenge and counter-revenge, to a world where might made right, and the weak had no recourse. Non-violence was not passive acceptance but active resistance, and it required as much courage as armed struggle, perhaps more. The personal cost of this commitment was immense. He lived under constant threat, watching friends and colleagues beaten and killed, knowing that he could be next at any moment. He struggled with fear and doubt, with the loneliness of leadership, with the gap between the public persona and the private man. He was not perfect, not a plaster saint, but a human being with flaws and failings, and the knowledge of his own imperfection made him more rather than less admirable. He kept going despite his limitations, despite his fears, because he believed he had to, because the work was too important to abandon. The FBI's surveillance of him, revealed years after his death through leaked documents and Freedom of Information Act requests, showed the lengths to which the government would go to discredit him. They had wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, compiled dossiers on his personal life, and sent him anonymous letters urging him to commit suicide. The depth of the surveillance was shocking, a window into the paranoia of those in power who saw any challenge to the status quo as a threat to national security. That he had continued his work knowing he was being watched, knowing that his private moments were being recorded and would likely be used against him, spoke to a kind of courage that went beyond physical bravery. In the end, what remained was the example of a life lived in service of something larger than itself. He had been given gifts, intelligence and eloquence and charisma, and he had used those gifts not for personal gain, but for the liberation of his people and the transformation of his nation. He had stood at the intersection of faith and politics, of moral vision and practical strategy, and he had shown that it was possible to be both prophetic and pragmatic, to dream of the impossible while working patiently toward the achievable. The music of the movement lived on, the spirituals and freedom songs that had sustained people through long nights in jail and on dangerous marches. "We Shall Overcome" became an anthem not just for civil rights, but for struggles around the world, sung in languages he had never spoken, in countries he had never visited. The melody carried within it the pain and hope of generations, the refusal to accept defeat, the insistence that change was not only necessary, but inevitable if people were willing to fight for it. His sermons were recorded and transcribed, and they continued to be read and studied long after his voice had been silenced. They revealed a mind steeped in scripture and history, able to draw connections between ancient texts and contemporary struggles, to make the prophets of Israel speak to the condition of 20th century America. He preached about Amos and his call for justice to roll down like waters, about the Good Samaritan and the imperative to help those in need regardless of tribal loyalties, about the cross and the price that must be paid for standing against evil. The March on Washington remained his most visible moment, the speech everyone remembered, but those who knew his work best often pointed to other moments as more revealing of his character. The long nights of the Montgomery boycott, when the movement could have collapsed but held together through sheer determination. The letter from Birmingham jail, written in confinement, articulating with precision and passion the moral case for civil disobedience. The speech at Riverside Church against the Vietnam War, when he risked everything to speak a truth that needed to be spoken. The last speech in Memphis, when he seemed to see beyond the veil and prepare his followers for what was coming. His philosophical influences were diverse, drawing from both Western and Eastern traditions, from Christianity and Gandhi, from Hegel and Marx, from the Black Church and the social gospel. He was not an original thinker in the academic sense, did not develop new philosophical systems, but he was a brilliant synthesizer, able to take ideas from different sources and weave them into a coherent vision. His dissertation had been on the concept of God in the thought of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman, and while his academic work was competent rather than groundbreaking, it showed his engagement with serious theological questions. The accusation of plagiarism that surfaced years after his death, evidence that portions of his dissertation and some speeches had been taken from other sources without proper attribution, complicated his legacy but did not fundamentally alter it. It revealed that he was a product of a particular tradition, the Black Church, where borrowing and adapting the words of others was common practice, where the power of an idea mattered more than its origin. It also showed the immense pressure he was under, producing speeches and sermons constantly while leading a movement, and the ways that he sometimes took shortcuts. But the core of his contribution was not in the originality of individual phrases, but in the way he gave voice to the aspirations of millions, became the vessel through which their hopes and dreams could be expressed. The children who had marched in Birmingham grew up and told their own children and grandchildren about what it had been like, about the fire hoses and the dogs, about the fear and the exhilaration, about the sense that they were part of something that mattered. Those children became teachers and activists and politicians, carrying forward the work in different forms. Some grew cynical, disillusioned by the slow pace of change and the persistence of racism. Others remained hopeful, believing that the arc of history was still bending, however slowly, toward justice. The photographs from the movement became iconic, reproduced endlessly in textbooks and documentaries. The images of him being arrested, of marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, of the crowd at the March on Washington stretching back as far as the eye could see. These images entered the collective memory, became part of the visual language through which Americans understood their history. But photographs flatten and simplify, and the reality was always more complex, more ambiguous, more human than any image could capture. His widow, Coretta, became a figure of dignity and grace, representing his legacy with a quiet strength that won respect even from those who had opposed him. She marched for women's rights and against apartheid in South Africa, expanded the work of the King Center, and spoke at countless events, keeping his message alive. She understood that a legacy could be lost if it was not actively preserved and interpreted, that each generation needed to rediscover the meaning of his life for themselves. When she spoke, people heard echoes of him, not in the voice, but in the moral clarity, the refusal to compromise on fundamental principles. The question of violence and nonviolence remained contested long after his death. Some argued that his commitment to nonviolence had been vindicated, that the legislative victories of the civil rights movement proved that moral persuasion could work. Others pointed to the ways that those victories had been limited and reversed, the ways that structural racism had adapted to new forms, and argued that a more militant approach might have achieved more. The debate was not merely academic, but reflected genuine disagreement about strategy and tactics, about what methods could actually produce lasting change. What could not be disputed was his courage. Whatever criticisms might be made of his strategy or philosophy, no one who examined the record could doubt that he had been willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed in. He had faced down the most violent defenders of white supremacy, had gone to jail repeatedly, had continued his work despite constant death threats, had given up security and comfort, and ultimately his life for the cause. This kind of courage was rare, and it inspired people across lines of race and nation and ideology. The dream he had spoken of at the March on Washington became his most quoted words, repeated so often that they lost some of their power, became a cliché. But when heard in context, in the full speech with its indictment of American society and its urgent demand for change, the dream revealed itself as more radical than the sanitized version suggested. He was not offering a vague hope that someday things might get better, but issuing a demand that the nation live up to its professed ideals immediately, that it stop writing bad checks to its black citizens, that it recognize the fierce urgency of now. The years between his death and the present stretched into decades, and the world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to him. Technology transformed communication and commerce. The Cold War ended, new conflicts emerged, and the conversation about race evolved in complex ways. But the fundamental questions he had grappled with remained relevant. How should a society treat its most vulnerable members? What obligations do the powerful have to the powerless? How can justice be pursued without resorting to the very violence that perpetuates injustice? These were not questions that could be answered once, and for all but required each generation to wrestle with them anew. His grave became a pilgrimage site, people coming from around the world to pay their respects, to leave flowers, to stand in silence before the marble crypt that held his remains and those of his wife. The inscription read, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty I'm free at last." Words from an old spiritual that he had quoted at the end of the march on Washington's speech. It was a fitting epitaph, capturing both the struggle and the hope, the pain and the possibility that had defined his life. The movement he had led did not end with his death, but continued in different forms, sometimes invoking his name and sometimes moving beyond him to articulate new visions and strategies. The work of justice was never finished, each victory revealing new challenges, each step forward contested by those who benefited from the status quo. But his life stood as proof that individuals could make a difference, that moral leadership mattered, that it was possible to stand against overwhelming power and not be broken. In the quiet moments, away from the crowds and the cameras, he had been a man who loved music and good food, who laughed with his children, who found solace in prayer and in the company of friends. He had been plagued by self-doubt, had struggled with the gap between the expectations placed upon him and his own sense of inadequacy. He had been human, fully and completely, and that humanity made his achievements all the more remarkable. He had not been born exceptional, but had become exceptional through the choices he made, the risks he took, the discipline with which he prepared himself for a role he had not sought but could not refuse. The legacy lived on in the institutions that bore his name, in the scholarships and awards given in his honor, in the King holiday, where people were encouraged to make it a day on, not a day off, to engage in service to their communities. It lived on in the countless activists who took inspiration from his example, who faced their own dangers and discouragements, knowing that he had walked that path before them. It lived on in the churches where his sermons were still preached, in the classrooms where his speeches were still studied, in the families who told their children about the man who had dreamed of a better world and given everything to make that dream real. The mystery at the heart of his life was how someone so young had achieved so much, had carried such weight, had spoken with such authority. Part of it was natural talent, the gifts he had been born with and cultivated through education and practice. Part of it was the moment he lived in, the unique combination of circumstances that made his leadership possible and necessary. But part of it was something harder to name, a quality of spirit that transcended analysis, a sense that he had been touched by something larger than himself and had surrendered to it completely. In the end, he was both a man of his time and a figure who transcended his time, rooted in the particular struggles of Black Americans in the mid-20th century, but articulating principles that spoke to universal human yearnings for dignity and justice. He belonged to history, but also to the present, his words and example continually rediscovered and reinterpreted by new generations seeking guidance for their own struggles. The story of his life was not finished, could never be finished, because the work he had begun remained incomplete and would require the efforts of countless others to carry forward. And so the story ended not with death but with continuity, not with closure but with opening, not with answers but with questions that each person had to answer for themselves. What would you be willing to sacrifice for justice? How would you respond to violence and hatred? What does it mean to love your enemies? What is your obligation to the suffering of others? These were the questions his life posed, and they echoed across the years, waiting for responses that could only be given through action, through choices made in the crucible of real-world struggle, through lives lived in service of something larger than self. The night air in Memphis had been cool that April evening, and somewhere in the city, the sanitation workers, whose cause he had come to support, were preparing for another day on the picket line. Not knowing that the man who had come to help them would not live to see the march he had planned. The bullet that struck him down ended one life, but could not end what that life had stood for, could not silence the voice that had spoken truth to power, could not extinguish the light that had illuminated a path forward. That light continued to shine, sometimes brightly and sometimes dimly, but never completely going out, never letting the darkness have the final word, never ceasing to call people toward the beloved community that remained always just beyond reach, and yet always worth striving for. The years that followed his death were marked by a kind of collective bewilderment, a sense that something essential had been lost and could not be recovered. The Poor People's Campaign struggled forward without his leadership, thousands gathering in Washington as planned, erecting a shantytown on the National Mall that they called Resurrection City. The encampment was meant to dramatize the reality of poverty in America, to force the nation to confront what it preferred to ignore. But the spring rains turned the site into a muddy morass. Tensions erupted among the diverse groups that had come together, and without his unifying presence, the coalition began to fracture. The authorities eventually cleared the camp, and while the campaign had drawn attention to the issue of poverty, It did not produce the legislative victories that had been hoped for. Ralph Abernathy assumed leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a burden he bore with dignity, but without the charisma and strategic brilliance that had made his predecessor so effective. Abernathy had been the steady companion, the loyal friend who had stood beside him through every danger, but he was not the same kind of leader, and perhaps no one could have been. The organization struggled to find its footing in a changed landscape, where the clarity of fighting legal segregation had given way to more diffuse battles against poverty and institutional racism that lacked clear targets or obvious solutions. The riots that erupted in more than 100 cities after the assassination were both a tribute and a rebuke. People poured into the streets in anguish and rage, and some of that rage expressed itself in fire and looting, in destruction that consumed whole neighborhoods. The man who had preached nonviolence had been killed, and the irony was not lost on anyone. Some saw in the violence a vindication of those who had argued that nonviolence could not work in America, that the system would only respond to force. Others saw it as a tragic betrayal of everything he had stood for, a descent into chaos that would only bring more suffering to the communities that were already suffering most. President Johnson pushed through the Fair Housing Act in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, legislation that had been stalled but was now passed as a kind of tribute. It prohibited discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, another legal victory in the long struggle for equality. But laws on paper did not immediately translate into changed reality, and the patterns of residential segregation that had been established over decades proved remarkably resistant to legal remedies. White flight from cities accelerated, resources followed wealth to the suburbs, and urban neighborhoods were left to decay, creating new forms of separation that did not require explicit legal sanction. The trial of James Earl Ray, the man accused of the assassination, was brief and unsatisfying. Ray pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 99 years in prison, avoiding a trial that might have revealed more about the circumstances of the killing. He later recanted his confession, claiming he had been a patsy in a larger conspiracy, and spent the rest of his life trying to get a new trial. The King family eventually came to believe that Ray had not acted alone, that there had been a conspiracy involving elements of the government, though they could never prove it to the satisfaction of official investigations. The doubts lingered, contributing to a broader skepticism about official narratives and the trustworthiness of institutions. The FBI's COINTELPRO operation, which had targeted him and other civil rights leaders, was exposed in the early 1970s when activists broke into an FBI office and released documents to the press. The revelation shocked many who had not fully understood the extent to which the government had worked to undermine the movement. The surveillance, the planted stories, the efforts to create discord within organizations, all of it painted a picture of a security apparatus that saw domestic dissent as a threat to be neutralized. The exposure led to reforms and oversight, but it also confirmed what many in the movement had long suspected, that they had been fighting not just segregationists, but the power of the state itself. His children grew up in the spotlight, carrying a name that was both a blessing and a burden. The eldest, Yolanda, became an actress and activist, using performance as a way to keep her father's message alive. Martin Luther King, III, followed his father into civil rights work, serving as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference for a time, though he struggled to escape the comparison to his father. Dexter became a business executive and later took on management of the King estate, a role that sometimes put him at odds with those who felt the legacy should be freely available rather than controlled and monetized. Bernice, the youngest, became a minister like her father and grandfather, finding her own voice while honoring the tradition she had inherited. The family disputes over the estate and how to manage his legacy were painful and public, revealing the tensions that existed even among those who loved him most. There were disagreements about which speeches and writings should be licensed, and for what purposes, about whether his image should be used in commercial contexts, about how to balance preservation with accessibility. These were not easy questions, and reasonable people could disagree, but the public nature of the disagreements sometimes obscured the genuine love and respect that all the family members had for their father and his work. Coretta emerged as a leader in her own right, though she was often still defined primarily through her relationship to him. She had been a young woman with her own dreams when they married, talented and ambitious, and she had set those dreams aside to support his work. After his death, she found a way to honor his legacy while also asserting her own voice. She spoke out on issues he had cared about, but also expanded the agenda, working for women's rights and LGBTQ equality, understanding that the struggle for justice could not be compartmentalized. She faced criticism from some who felt she was straying from his message, but she understood better than most that he had been constantly evolving, that his thinking had not been static, and that honoring his legacy meant continuing to push forward rather than freezing his ideas in amber. The King Center in Atlanta became a major institution, housing archives and hosting programs dedicated to teaching nonviolence and social change. Tourists came to visit his birth home and the church where he had preached, to see the crypt where he and Coretta were buried. The neighborhood around Auburn Avenue, which had declined after his death, was gradually revitalized, in part because of the draw of the historic sites. But there was something bittersweet about this, the way that a life dedicated to change had become a tourist attraction, the way that radical ideas had been smoothed into safe historical narratives suitable for school field trips. The literature about him multiplied, biographies and academic studies and collections of speeches and sermons. Historians debated his place in the pantheon of American leaders, comparing him to Lincoln and Jefferson and other figures who had shaped the nation's trajectory. Most concluded that he belonged in that company, that his moral vision and practical achievements warranted inclusion among the greatest Americans. But there were also critical studies that examined his failings, his treatment of women in the movement, his complicated personal life, the ways that his leadership had sometimes marginalized other voices and perspectives. These critiques were important, a necessary corrective to hagiography, though they sometimes risked losing sight of the forest for the trees, focusing so much on flaws that the genuine greatness became obscured. The scholars who studied his theology found depth that were often missing from popular accounts. He had wrestled seriously with questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, the relationship between faith and action. His doctoral dissertation had explored how different theologians conceived of God's relationship to the world, and while the work was not wholly original, it showed a mind engaged with fundamental questions. He had been influenced by the social gospel movement, which emphasized Christianity's responsibility to address social problems, and by personalism, which understood God as a personal being in relationship with creation. These theological commitments undergirded his activism, providing a framework that was more than just strategic calculation. The international dimension of his influence became more apparent over time. Nelson Mandela in South Africa spoke of being inspired by his example during the long years of imprisonment. The Solidarity movement in Poland drew on non-violent resistance tactics that echoed those of the civil rights movement. Students in Tiananmen Square sang, "We shall overcome," in Mandarin. The Arab Spring protesters studied the strategies of non-violent direct action. In each case, people facing oppressive systems looked to his life as proof that resistance was possible, that moral courage could challenge even the most entrenched power structures. But the global spread of his ideas also led to their dilution and misappropriation. Leaders who had no genuine commitment to justice invoked his name to legitimize themselves. His words about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin were quoted by those opposing affirmative action, turning his message into something he would not have recognized. His emphasis on non-violence was used to delegitimize protests that made people uncomfortable, as if he had counseled passivity rather than active resistance. Fighting these distortions became part of the ongoing work of preserving his legacy. The annual King holiday, established in 1986 after years of lobbying, became a strange hybrid of commemoration and commercialization. Some people used the day for service projects and reflection, engaging seriously with his life and teachings. Others treated it as just another day off, an opportunity for shopping and leisure. The official celebrations often featured speeches that praised him in the abstract while carefully avoiding the more challenging aspects of his message. Politicians who would have opposed his actual positions lined up to pay tribute to a sanitized version of the man, praising his dream while ignoring his demands. The monuments continued to multiply. In addition to the memorial in Washington, statues were erected in cities across the country and around the world. Some were powerful works of art that captured something essential about him, the determination and dignity and moral seriousness. Others were mediocre or worse, generic representations that could have been of anyone. The sheer number of memorials sometimes felt excessive, as if commemorating him in stone and bronze could substitute for actually continuing his work. The speeches he had delivered were dissected and analyzed, parsed for meaning and technique. Communication scholars studied his use of repetition and rhythm, the way he built to crescendos, the blending of biblical language with constitutional rhetoric. Rhetoricians identified the classical techniques he employed, the use of anaphora and metaphor and antithesis. But something was always lost in the analysis, the way that breaking down the mechanics of a speech could not fully explain its power, could not account for the way his voice had moved people to action, had given them courage to face what they feared. The question of what he would think about various contemporary issues became a kind of game, everyone claiming him for their side. Conservatives argued that he would have opposed identity politics and supported color blindness. Progressives insisted he would have been at the forefront of Black Lives Matter and other contemporary movements. The truth was that he existed in his own time and context, and while his principles might offer guidance, simple extrapolation was impossible. He had been constantly evolving, always rethinking his positions in light of new circumstances, and there was no reason to think that process would have stopped had he lived. The economic justice agenda he had begun to emphasize in his final years received renewed attention during periods of economic crisis. When the financial system collapsed in 2008 and inequality reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, people returned to his speeches about poverty and the need for economic restructuring. His call for a guaranteed income sounded less radical when serious economists were proposing similar ideas. His critique of capitalism's tendency to value profits over people resonated with a new generation, questioning whether the system could be reformed or needed to be replaced. His opposition to the Vietnam War was vindicated by history, as the war ended in defeat and the domino theory that had justified it was discredited. The Pentagon Papers and other revelations showed that the war had been based on lies and miscalculations, that the government had known it was unwinnable long before it admitted this publicly. His willingness to speak against the war despite the political cost looked prophetic in retrospect, evidence of a moral courage that transcended political calculation. Later wars in Iraq and Afghanistan prompted renewed interest in his anti-war stance, as activists opposing those conflicts looked for historical examples of principled opposition. The technology that emerged in the decades after his death would have been unimaginable to him. The internet and social media transformed how movements organized and communicated, allowing for rapid mobilization, but also fragmenting attention and enabling new forms of surveillance. The cell phone cameras that captured police violence against black citizens created a visual record that was both powerful and traumatic, forcing a broader public to confront realities that had long been denied or ignored. These technologies raised questions about how his strategies of nonviolent resistance would need to adapt to a world where every action could be recorded and broadcast instantly. The descendants of those who had opposed him sometimes grappled with their own family histories, discovering letters or documents that revealed their grandparents had been on the wrong side of history. Some publicly acknowledged this and committed to doing better. Others remained defensive, insisting that their ancestors had been good people who were simply products of their time, as if that absolved them of moral responsibility. The question of how to judge historical figures by the standards of their own time versus universal moral principles was not easily resolved. Though it seemed clear that he had understood that segregation was wrong, that others in his time had understood this, and that claiming ignorance was not an adequate defense. The FBI surveillance tapes, which remained sealed, became a subject of fascination and speculation. What exactly did they contain? How damaging were they? The Bureau had clearly used information gleaned from the surveillance to try to destroy him, sending him the infamous letter urging him to commit suicide, leaking information to reporters to damage his reputation. The full contents of the tapes were supposed to be released in 2027, 50 years after his death, though there were efforts to prevent this. The prospect raised difficult questions about privacy and legacy, about what the public needed to know versus what should remain private, about how to evaluate a person's character and contributions when their flaws were exposed. The religious communities he had been part of continued to grapple with his legacy. The black church tradition that had produced him remained a vital force in African American life, though it faced challenges from secularization and generational change. White churches that had been silent or actively hostile during the civil rights movement engaged in various degrees of reckoning, some offering apologies and commitments to anti-racism work, others remaining defensive or indifferent. The question of whether Christianity could be a force for liberation, or whether it was inherently complicit with oppression, remained contested, with different sides claiming him as evidence for their position. His sermons revealed a preacher who took seriously the pastoral dimensions of ministry, who comforted the grieving and counseled the troubled, who understood that people needed hope and meaning in their individual lives, even as they struggled for collective liberation. He preached about personal transformation and spiritual growth, about the need to love enemies and forgive those who wronged you, about finding strength in prayer and community. These themes could seem disconnected from the political work, but for him, they were inseparable, all part of a holistic vision of what it meant to be fully human. The photographs of him showed a man aging rapidly under the pressures of leadership. In the early pictures from Montgomery, he looked young and optimistic, energized by the possibilities opening before him. By the time of the Poor People's Campaign, the weight showed in his face, in the lines around his eyes, in the weariness that no amount of rest could fully erase. The final photographs from Memphis showed someone who looked older than his 39 years, someone who had given everything and knew there was little left to give. The colleagues who had worked alongside him in the movement wrote their own memoirs, offering different perspectives on the shared struggle. Some portrayed him as a singular genius whose vision had guided everything. Others emphasized the collective nature of the movement, the countless local leaders and ordinary people whose courage had made the victories possible, arguing that too much credit had been given to one man. Both perspectives held truth. He had been essential, irreplaceable in certain ways, but he had also been the beneficiary of a movement that was larger than any individual, that would have continued in some form even without him. The music that had sustained the movement, the freedom songs that had been sung in churches and on marches and in jail cells, continued to be performed and recorded. Artists across genres drew on that tradition, keeping alive the melodies and the spirit they embodied. The songs were simple enough that anyone could sing them, but they carried depths of meaning, encoded experiences of suffering and resistance that could not be fully articulated in any other way. When people sang, "We shall overcome," or "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around," they were connecting to a tradition that stretched back through the civil rights movement to the abolition movement to the enslaved Africans who had sung spirituals as acts of survival and resistance. The question of masculinity and leadership in the movement received new attention from scholars examining gender dynamics. The movement had been dominated by male leaders, with women doing much of the organizing work, but receiving little recognition. Rosa Parks was remembered, and a few others, but countless women who had been essential to the movement's success remained obscure. He had worked with talented women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, but the relationship had sometimes been tense, with his more hierarchical approach conflicting with their more democratic and participatory vision. Understanding these tensions did not diminish his contributions, but complicated the picture, made clear that even movements for justice replicated some of the inequalities they fought against. His doctoral training had given him a facility with ideas and argument that served him well in debates and negotiations. He could speak the language of theology and philosophy when talking with religious leaders, shift to constitutional law and political theory when engaging with politicians and lawyers, and communicate in the vernacular of the Black church when preaching to his core constituency. This code switching was a survival skill that many Black Americans developed, the ability to navigate between different worlds, but he had refined it to an art form. The boycotts and sit-ins and marches that had been the tactics of the movement were studied and adapted by later activists. The methods were not easily transferable, requiring discipline and training and a supportive community infrastructure that did not always exist. The workshops on nonviolence that had prepared people for demonstrations had taught them how to protect themselves when attacked, how to remain calm in the face of provocation, how to respond to violence with steadfast love. This preparation was essential, and attempts to use similar tactics without it often failed or led to chaos. The international travels he had undertaken to India and Africa and Europe had broadened his perspective and deepened his understanding of how racism and colonialism were global systems rather than just American problems. Meeting with leaders of independence movements in Africa had reinforced his sense that the struggle for Black freedom in America was part of a larger global movement of colonized and oppressed peoples demanding dignity and self-determination. He had seen parallels between the treatment of Black Americans and the treatment of colonized peoples everywhere, understood that white supremacy was an international ideology that needed to be fought on multiple fronts. The Nobel Prize had been both an honor and a complication, elevating his international stature, but also making him a target for those who resented the attention and the implied criticism of America. The prize money, which he donated entirely to the movement, could have provided financial security for his family, but he never hesitated in giving it away. Money had never motivated him, though he was not entirely unworldly about it, understanding that resources were necessary to sustain the work. The theological concept of the beloved community that he often invoked was more than just integrated lunch counters or voting rights. It was a vision of society fundamentally transformed, where economic justice and racial equality and peace were not separate goals, but dimensions of a single project. The beloved community would be one where no one was poor, where no one was oppressed, where conflicts were resolved through dialogue rather than violence, where love rather than fear governed human relations. It was utopian, and he knew it, but he believed that working toward an impossible ideal could move society in the right direction, even if the ideal was never fully realized. The resistance he faced from white moderates who supported civil rights in principle, but opposed every specific action to achieve it, had been one of his deepest frustrations. These were people who said they agreed with the goals, but thought the methods were too disruptive, who counseled patience and warned that moving too fast would provoke backlash. He had addressed this directly in the letter from Birmingham jail, arguing that the moderate who preferred order to justice was a greater obstacle than the outright racist, because the moderate drained energy and support from the movement while claiming to be an ally. The backlash did come, of course, as the moderates had warned. The election of Richard Nixon in 1968 was partly a reaction against the civil rights movement and the urban riots, a reassertion of law and order that was often code for the suppression of black protest. The Southern strategy that Republicans employed, appealing to white racial resentment without using explicitly racist language, proved devastatingly effective and shaped American politics for decades. The progress that had been made was real but fragile, subject to erosion and reversal, and the project of defending and extending civil rights gains became the work of subsequent generations. His vision of non-violence extended beyond tactics to encompass a whole philosophy of human relations. He distinguished between non-resistance to evil, which was cowardice, and non-violent resistance, which required courage. He distinguished between passive acceptance of injustice and active resistance that refused to cooperate with evil systems. He distinguished between hating the person and opposing the unjust system, seeking to defeat injustice without destroying the opponent. These distinctions were subtle and easily misunderstood, which was why training and preparation were so important. The question of whether the movement had succeeded or failed depended on what metrics were used. Legal segregation had been dismantled, which was a major achievement. Political participation had increased dramatically. Economic opportunities had expanded for many Black Americans, but mass incarceration had created a new system of racial control. Wealth gaps had persisted and in some ways widened. Residential segregation remained entrenched. Judging the movement's success required grappling with this complexity, acknowledging real gains while recognizing how much remained to be done. The young people who discovered his speeches and writings decades after his death sometimes found them startlingly relevant to contemporary conditions. The description of police violence, the critique of economic inequality, the analysis of how poverty and racism were intertwined, all of it resonated with current realities. This was both encouraging, in that his insights remained valuable, and discouraging, in that the same problems persisted despite decades of struggle. The work he had begun was clearly unfinished, and it was unclear whether it would ever be completed or whether each generation would have to fight the same battles in new forms. The archives that preserved his papers became invaluable resources for researchers and educators. Thousands of documents and recordings that provided a detailed record of the movement. Reading his private correspondence revealed someone more uncertain and conflicted than the public persona suggested. Someone who struggled with decisions and doubted himself and sought counsel from friends and advisors. This humanized him, made him more relatable, showed that moral leadership did not require superhuman confidence, but could coexist with very human vulnerability. The anniversaries of his death became occasions for reflection and recommitment, moments to assess how far the nation had come and how far it still needed to go. Each generation found in his life and death different lessons and meanings, filtered through their own experiences and challenges. The 50th anniversary in 2018 prompted renewed attention to his economic justice agenda, with activists and scholars arguing that this dimension of his work had been neglected and needed to be recovered. The cities where major events of the movement had occurred became sites of memory and pilgrimage. Montgomery preserved the church and the bus where Rosa Parks had been arrested. Birmingham maintained the church that had been bombed and the park where protesters had been attacked. Selma kept the bridge where marchers had been beaten. These sites served as reminders of what had been sacrificed, what had been won, and what still needed defending. But they also raised questions about how to remember painful history, whether to preserve sites as they were or to transform them into something new, how to honor the past without being trapped by it. His philosophical debt to Hegel was evident in his understanding of history as a dialectical process, moving through conflict toward higher syntheses. He believed that the struggle between thesis and antithesis, between the forces of justice and injustice, would ultimately resolve in favor of justice, though not automatically or without human effort. This was the basis for his optimism, not a naive belief that everything would work out, but a conviction that history had a moral direction, and that those who aligned themselves with justice were working with rather than against the grain of the universe. The personal discipline he maintained, despite the chaos and pressure of his public life, was remarkable. He read constantly, staying abreast of theology and philosophy and current events. He wrote and revised his speeches carefully, even though he often departed from the text when delivering them, improvising in response to the energy of the crowd. He tried to maintain spiritual practices, prayer and meditation, though the demands on his time made this difficult. He sought moments of rest and recreation, but they were rare and often interrupted. The network of relationships he built, with religious leaders and politicians and activists and intellectuals, was essential to his effectiveness. He understood that change required coalition building, bringing together diverse groups with sometimes competing interests around common goals. This required political skill, the ability to listen and compromise and find common ground while not abandoning core principles. It required trust, which he earned through consistency and integrity, by following through on commitments and being honest even when the truth was uncomfortable. The sacrifices his family made were immense and ongoing. His children grew up without a father present for much of their childhood. His wife endured constant worry and the subordination of her own ambitions. His parents lived with the knowledge that their son was in constant danger. The toll this took was real and lasting, and the fact that the sacrifices served a larger purpose did not eliminate the pain. The children struggled in various ways with the legacy, some embracing it and others seeking distance, all of them shaped profoundly by being the children of an icon. The critiques from the left, from those who felt he was too moderate and too accommodating to white power structures, came from a real place and deserved serious engagement. Was integration into a fundamentally unjust system really liberation? Could appeals to American ideals work when those ideals had been used to justify oppression? Was nonviolence an effective strategy or a form of moral theater that allowed white Americans to feel good without actually giving up power? These were serious questions, and he had thought deeply about them, though his answers did not satisfy everyone. The influence of Gandhi on his thinking was profound, but not uncritical. He adapted Gandhi's philosophy to the American context, understanding that what had worked in India against British colonialism would need to be modified for the fight against American racism. He was also aware of criticisms of Gandhi, including those related to his views on caste and his treatment of women, and he did not simply import Gandhi's ideas wholesale, but rather drew on them selectively, integrating them with other influences from the Black church tradition and American political thought. The role of humor in his life is often overlooked in the solemn accounts of his work. He had a gift for storytelling and a quick wit, using humor to build connections with people and to defuse tension. In private settings, he could be playful and even irreverent, a relief from the weight of his public role. The ability to laugh, to find joy even in dark times, was a form of resistance and a source of resilience that helped him endure the pressures he faced. The concept of redemptive suffering that he often invoked was drawn from Christian theology, the idea that suffering for a righteous cause had spiritual value and could transform both the sufferer and those who witnessed the suffering. This was a difficult and potentially dangerous idea, as it could be used to justify passivity in the face of injustice or to romanticize suffering in ways that ignored its real costs. He was aware of these dangers, but believed that when suffering was voluntarily accepted as part of a struggle for justice, when it was unearned and borne with dignity, it could awaken the conscience of the oppressor and move the arc of history toward justice. The final months of his life were marked by a deepening sense of isolation and a growing awareness that the easy victories, if they had ever been easy, were behind him. The movement was fragmenting. The nation seemed to be turning away from the ideals he championed, and he faced opposition not just from white supremacists, but from former allies who thought he had gone too far or not far enough. The Poor People's Campaign was ambitious to the point of being quixotic, and he knew it might fail, but he felt compelled to try, to make one more push for economic justice before it was too late. The garbage workers' strike in Memphis that drew him there in his final days was exactly the kind of issue he had been focusing on in his last years, the intersection of race and labor, the dignity of work, and the right to fair wages. The workers carried signs saying, "I am a man," a simple but powerful assertion of humanity in the face of a system that treated them as disposable. He saw in their struggle a microcosm of the larger struggle for justice, and he committed to helping them even though it meant delaying other work. The speech he gave the night before he died had a quality of premonition that was eerie in retrospect. He talked about the threats against his life, about the possibility that he might not live to see the promised land. But he said he was not worried because he had been to the mountaintop and seen it. Whether this was genuine prescience or simply the awareness that his life was in constant danger, it gave the speech a power that moved those who heard it, and that echoes still through the years. When the shot rang out on that April evening, cutting short a life that had already accomplished so much, but still had so much to give, it sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. The man who had preached love had been struck down by hate. The man who had championed nonviolence had been murdered by an act of violence, and the contradictions were almost too bitter to bear. In the days and weeks that followed, as the nation mourned and rioted and struggled to make sense of what had been lost, it became clear that his death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in American history that had been brief but transformative. Yet, in another sense, his death was not an ending, but a beginning, the transformation of a man into a symbol, a life into a legacy, a story into a myth that would be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted by generations who had never known him, but who knew his name and his dream. The work he had begun would continue, carried forward by others who might not have his gifts, but who shared his commitment, who believed as he did that the arc of history, however long, bends toward justice. And so the story did not end on a motel balcony in Memphis, but continued in the streets and churches and schoolrooms and hearts of people who refused to accept that his death was the final word, who insisted that the dream lived on, that the struggle continued, that the beloved community was still possible if only people would work for it with the same courage and conviction and love that he had shown. The light he had kindled might flicker in the wind, but it could not be extinguished, for it lived now in too many hearts, illuminated too many minds to ever be fully put out. And that light continues still, a beacon for all who seek justice, a reminder of what one life devoted to righteousness can achieve, a testament to the enduring power of moral courage in a world that desperately needs it. The story of his life became a story without end, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that one person with courage and conviction could bend the world toward justice. He had walked among us for only 39 years, but the echoes of his voice would sound forever, calling humanity toward its better self, toward the beloved community that remained always just ahead, always worth reaching for. His body rested now beside Coretta's in Atlanta, but his spirit moved wherever people gathered to demand dignity, to resist oppression, to choose love over hate. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. But he had shown that it was possible, that change could come, that the long night of injustice would eventually give way to dawn. And in that truth, there was something like peace,